Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I wish I could join you in person. I am Michael Granoff. I'm the founder of Maniv Mobility. Maniv Mobility is a venture capital fund, but there are not very many venture capital funds you'll find that don't have the word venture or capital in their name. And it's not an accident because what defines what we do is mobility. The word, and that's what I'm going to use my short time this morning to chat about. The word mobility actually was not in use in the English language, at least very much, until the last number of years, even though it's a fairly generic word. And what was the reason for that? The reason was that mobility really was one mode, and that was automotive. The individually owned and operated internal combustion engine powered automobile really was the standard of how most people, most places in the world got around for 100 years. And that started on actually, you can point to the date that began. It was September 1st, 1908 in Detroit, Michigan, where Henry Ford rolled the first Model T off the assembly line. And that was really a transformative event because up to that point in time, most people in the world actually never strayed very far from where they were born. And the availability of a form of mobility that was affordable and practical for people made it possible, for middle-class families to purchase automobiles, infrastructure built up around that. Really, it's hard to point to anything more transformative in the 20th century than that. And what's interesting is that I would say the automotive age as such lasted really exactly 100 years, because it was in 2008 that a lot of things happened. First of all, there was the financial crisis, as we all recall, the bankruptcies of some major automakers, but also it was the invention of the first third-party apps on smartphones. And that, in my mind, marked the beginning of the age of the digitization of transportation. And that's when we started to have new forms of mobility that brought the word into vogue, and now it's one of the most exciting areas, I think, to be investing. At least we think so, because that's all we do. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, first of all, the two pillars that we see as the future of mobility and transportation. And those pillars are electrification and diversification. Electrification is really how I got involved in all of this to begin with. Nearly 20 years ago, when I was living in the United States, and I was realizing the US at that time was importing 70% of its oil. Oil was and still is a monopoly of transportation. Very few modes of transportation don't use oil. And oil also was not really being sold in a free market, but the production levels were being set, and therefore the price determined for the whole rest of the world. And I did a lot of reading and thinking about this in the period around 20 years ago. I said there must be an alternative to having this oil monopoly and all of the difficulties that it causes on the environment, as we all hear about frequently, but also on the global economy and on global security. And I started an organization in Washington, D.C. around that time called SAFE, Securing America's Future Energy, with a friend of mine who still runs it in Washington. And the point of that organization was to figure out and then promote policies that reduced the dependence of the U.S. on oil. And in 2006, we were successful in getting some legislation through the U.S. Congress and signed by the president, who was then George Bush, that increased the fuel economy standards for cars and trucks and had the first in the world electric vehicle incentives. And it was really at that point that I did a deep dive to understand electric transportation, understand batteries. And what I realized with the help of a lot of smart people that I found at MIT and other institutions was that the proliferation of devices and the advent of smartphones was bringing battery technology to the fore, and dollars for research were pouring into it. And there was a clear trajectory that the price of energy storage was going to decline pretty precipitously over the following decade. That, in conjunction with my presumption that the price of oil was going to just continue to go up, made me believe that electrification of transportation actually became inevitable at that point. And I was right about the first part of the equation, in that the price of energy storage did fall by about tenfold over the last decade. I was wrong about the second part, about oil only going up, because surprisingly, in 2011, with the advent of shale drilling technologies, the U.S. came out of a 40-year decline in oil production and again began to produce massive amounts of oil and stabilized the price for the 2010s, delaying the electrification revolution. But I think it is not even really controversial anymore to say that that electrification revolution is now upon us. Tesla obviously would be the poster child for it, but we see all the major automakers really declaring dates by which they intend for their whole fleet to be electric. We see countries, cities, regions saying that they're only going to permit electric cars by a certain date. And I think everybody understands that's the direction of things. And by the way, electrification of transportation means more than cars. And that's where we get into diversification. And diversification is enabled by electrification and by digital tools like smartphones, but it takes many, many forms. For example, ownership. In the past, you would buy your internal combustion engine car, keep it for some number of years, maybe sell it on the secondary market. Leases came along, and that was at least very popular in the U.S. for people to have their cars on long-term leases. But one of the companies in our portfolio that actually recently got acquired is a company that offers car subscriptions, which I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with, where you get your car, it could be for a month or for 6 months or for a year or two, but it's really a very simple process that allows you to bundle everything associated with the usage of that car into a single line item on your credit card, and you have subscription. This is just a sort of variation on car ownership. And ownership is one of the ways of diversification of mobility that we see that is taking root. There are form factor mobility. Form factors is another form of diversification within mobility. I don't know if outside there in VILNIUS there are scooters, but I imagine there are. There are in, I would say, probably most major cities in the world these days, and Tel Avive is certainly no exception. There are 4 operators of two-wheel scooters in Tel Avive, and they have become enormously popular ways to get around because they're inexpensive, they're easy to use, you can pick them up anywhere and leave them anywhere, and you don't have to contend with traffic. And it's actually, more fun than sitting in the back of a taxi, and even it gets you to your destination faster in many ways. So that's one form factor. E-bikes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's gone on over the last year with e-bikes, that also enabled by electrification, diversification, the digitization of mobility. And they also you can own your e-bike, you can subscribe to your e-bike, or you can just rent it on a per-use basis in lots of cities. And increasingly, that's a model that we're seeing. And various other business models contribute more to the diversification of mobility. Then there's automation, autonomy. And probably if we were sitting here 5 years ago, there would be a lot of people who would presume that we were on the cusp of all autonomous vehicles, of self-driving cars, of robotic taxis taking you around cities. That was a romantic image that really became extremely hyped up a number of years ago. And it did a lot of good, that hype, I'd say. First of all, a lot of money has been put into research that has contributed to safety. And it also has contributed to other businesses in our portfolio that have increased the safety of cars and other things. And I do think that there's a big role for automation over the next decade, although I think it's going to happen differently than was thought of before. I don't think we're going to see most cities with robotic taxis in the next few years, but I do think we're going to increasingly see trucks become highly automated and maybe in some places fully automated over the next number of years. There's a economic imperative for that because of a shortage of truck drivers really all around the world, and the ability and the fact that the technology to have a level 4 autonomous truck is pretty mature and is obviously easier to do than in a very complex environment like a city. Also, last mile delivery. We've seen lots of companies that have these robots for sidewalk delivery, and I think we will see more automation in that form. And then ultimately, I do think we will see more robotic taxis. There are services that exist today, including Waymo outside of Phoenix, Arizona, where you can actually use as a consumer their autonomous ride-share vehicle, effectively a robotic taxi, and I think we'll see more of that. But the bottom line is that I think all of this represents the third wave of digitization. And we had information and communication become digitized over a 30-year period, beginning in 1990s. And I think we're now really maybe towards the end of the first decade of the digitization of transportation. And I think that that digitization will contribute to us having more options to get around that are less expensive, that are cleaner and safer and more accessible to more people, which is a great thing, because when you have more mobility physically, it gives you more mobility in every other way as well, including social mobility and economic mobility, and that's why we're so excited about what we do. Maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about our fund and a couple of the companies. We're based in Tel Aviv with an office in the U.S. and with portfolio companies in 8 countries and limited partners in even more countries than that. So we're very global. Although we got started investing in deep technology around mostly automated mobility in Israel. And there we have companies such as Halo, which develops silicon chips that are for edge computing to enable low energy, high compute on onboard vehicles. To enable another example of something that creates a safer environment for transportation, but also will lead to the ability to have automation in the future. We have a company that does simulation to test autonomous systems. That company is called Cognata, a company that does teleoperation, which means that you can sort of sit in one place and be driving a car somewhere completely different, even on a different continent. And that company, Phantom Auto, that's a technology that has applications for autonomy, but also has lots of other applications, and they're pursuing all of them right now. We have a company that's based in Australia called Zumo that designs and produces e-bikes specifically for the delivery courier function. And we've all seen, especially in the last few years, the proliferation of services to deliver goods in cities. And e-bikes are, in fact, probably the single most efficient mode in most cities to deliver goods. And Zumo's focused specifically on that application. It's now operating in the US, in Europe, and in some other places as well, including Australia. And that's a very exciting company to watch. And finally, I'll highlight a company we have in the US called Revel, which I think epitomizes both the major themes I talked about, electrification and diversification. So Revel operates 6,000 electric mopeds. I know moped is not a word that's familiar everywhere because people call them differently, but think of Vespa, think of a small form motorcycle that doesn't go as fast, but does go faster than a scooter or a bicycle and allows moving around cities. So Revel operates 6,000 of these on a shared platform in 5 cities in the US. So if you're in New York City and you see one of these blue mopeds parked on the side of the street, you can download the app, you can take that moped across New York, park it in any legal parking spot, which is easy to do because of the size. And it's become a very popular, again, less expensive, more efficient, cleaner, and a fun way to get around town. Revel has also opened 2 other significant lines of business this year, aside from the electric mopeds. In New York now, Revel's operating a fleet of rideshare vehicles. So, you think about Uber or Kareem or whatever the major rideshare operator is where you are. Revel's operating on a model that's different along 3 different verticals. First of all, they own all the cars. It's not that they bring on drivers that have their own cars. Revel owns all the cars, and that in itself really creates a very, very different product. Second of all, it hires the drivers as full-time employees. They're not gig employees, and they work for the company, and they have a stake in the company's success. And that also, I think, contributes to the product. And the third is, of course, all the cars are electric. In fact, right now, all the cars that Revel is operating in New York City are Teslas. We found that is something that the public is really embracing. Alongside this rideshare product, Revel has also opened DC fast charge outlets in New York City. One is fully operational, another will come online soon, and they intend to do more and to do them in other geographies as well. And these 2 products actually go hand in hand. So the rideshare vehicles come to charge at DC fast charge, but they leave a lot of excess capacity that then there's a demand for from the public. And in fact, more than a demand, we're finding that there are people in Brooklyn, New York, for example, who are now going out and buying electric cars as they always wanted to, but they didn't have a place to charge them. And now they have this DC fast charge near their home, and they can go for 20 minutes a week, do the fast charge, and have their electric car conveniently. And so Revel is really seeking to become an electric hub for urban mobility. I think I'm nearing the end of my 15 minutes. I hope I've been able to convey to you why we at Maniv love to invest in this space, and why we think there is still an enormous amount of interesting things to be uncovered as we move through the age of digital mobility. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Michael, very much indeed. I think that the slogan, "The future is now," is the right time to say it. The future is now, basically what you said. And throughout these 2 days, we had a lot of presentations and discussions about, and all your insight just confirms it. So I just have one slight question. Yesterday, we had a presentation from a German startup regarding some air taxi. It's like a drone which could, autonomously or with the driver fly people over. What's your stance towards such technology?
It's an interesting question. I definitely think that air transport is going to be an important part of digital mobility. We've looked at a lot of things. We looked at drones and air taxis and the like. So far have not had the courage to sort of get off the ground, but we expect that we will at some point in the near future, because there's no question it's going to play an important role. And there are all sorts of interesting companies, from Lilium in Germany to Archer in the US, and many more that are looking at eVTOLs and other variations on electric air mobility. With digital tools, it can be made safe and clean. And so, and it's obviously going to be a very efficient way to move about. So looking forward to seeing technology develop on that front as well. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. And we do hope that you can stay here for a bit longer from your part of screen. Thanks, Michael.